Lisa stood in the center of what had once been Main Street, surrounded by a silence so complete it felt like death itself had settled over Springwood. The morning sun cast long shadows between empty storefronts, their windows dark and hollow like the eye sockets of skulls. A newspaper tumbled down the abandoned street, pushed by wind that carried the faint scent of ash and something else, something that smelled disturbingly like burned flesh. 6 weeks had passed since she'd awakened in that music box nightmare, since she'd somehow broken free from the mechanical dance that had trapped her and her brother David in eternal, guilty torment. 6 weeks since she'd opened her eyes in her own bed, gasping and sobbing, expecting to find the familiar comfort of her bedroom but instead discovering a town that had been hemorrhaging residents. The exodus had begun immediately after Mark's death. She'd learned from the few scattered records left behind in hastily abandoned offices. Families had packed up in the middle of the night, leaving behind mortgages and jobs and entire lives without explanation. The smart ones had fled quickly, some instinct warning them that Springwood had become a place where children died in their sleep and reality itself couldn't be trusted. Lisa walked past Morton's hardware store, its "closed indefinitely" sign hanging crooked in the dust-streaked window. Inside, she could see tools still arranged on their pegboards, price tags yellowed with age, as if the owner had simply vanished mid-transaction. The cash register drawer hung open, empty except for a few scattered pennies that caught the morning light like dead eyes. The high school had been shuttered within days of Sarah's death. Not officially, the district claimed it was for emergency maintenance and structural concerns, but everyone knew the real reason. Too many dead children, too many grieving parents, too many questions that had no rational answers. The building sat empty now, its windows boarded up and its parking lot cracked with weeds that grew in patterns that looked disturbingly like sprawling fingers. Lisa paused in front of the old Springwood library, the one place she'd expected to find answers during those terrible weeks when her friends were dying one by one. But Mrs. Kowalski was gone too, along with most of the historical records that might have explained what had been hunting them. The few documents that remained painted a picture of a cycle that repeated every 20 years with clockwork precision. Groups of teenagers chosen seemingly at random, hunted through their dreams until madness and death claimed them all. Almost all. There were always survivors, she'd discovered. 1 or 2 from each cycle who somehow escaped the slaughter, left to carry the weight of what they'd witnessed. But their testimonies were fragmented, unreliable, often dismissed as the ravings of trauma victims who'd snapped under pressure. Reading their accounts, Lisa had recognized her own fractured mental state reflected in their desperate attempts to make sense of the impossible. She'd tried to piece together a pattern from the survivors' stories, but the details were frustratingly vague. Some claimed they'd defeated their tormentor through willpower or faith. Others insisted they'd simply been overlooked, forgotten in the creature's hunger for more satisfying prey. A few maintained that they'd never truly escaped at all, that they remained trapped in extended nightmares, living out false realities while their true selves remained imprisoned in dreams. That last possibility haunted Lisa more than she cared to admit. The music box had stopped playing on the night she'd supposedly escaped, its mechanical melody falling silent just as she'd opened her eyes in her own bed. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she could swear she heard the distant tingling of its tune drifting through her house like an echo from another world. She tried to convince herself it was just auditory hallucinations, residual trauma from her ordeal. But the music always seemed to come from specific locations: her brother's old room, the basement where he'd kept his toys, the garage where their mother's car had been parked the night of the accident. It followed a logic that suggested something more than random neural misfiring. Lisa walked past the abandoned gas station where Mark had sometimes bought his drugs, its pumps standing like crow monuments to a world that no longer existed. The owner had been one of the first to leave, she remembered, packing up his family and disappearing without even bothering to close out his accounts. Smart man. He'd recognized the signs before it was too late. Not everyone had been so fortunate. She thought about the parents who'd stayed too long, who'd refused to abandon their homes and businesses despite the growing evidence that Springwood had become a place where children died for no reason anyone could explain. They'd clung to rational explanations: stress, drugs, teenage suicide clusters, anything that fit into their understanding of how the world worked. Most of them had learned the truth too late. Lisa turned down Elm Street, passing house after house with "For Sale" signs planted in overgrown yards like grave markers. The few homes that showed signs of recent habitation were clustered together at the far end of the street, their occupants apparently believing that proximity offered some protection against whatever had claimed their neighbors' children. They were wrong, of course. Geography meant nothing to something that hunted through dreams. The Henderson house sat empty at 1428 Elm Street, its windows dark and its lawn gone to seed. Lisa had researched the property records before most of the municipal offices had closed, learning that it had been abandoned repeatedly over the decades. Every 20 years, new owners would move in during the quiet periods, drawn by the reasonable price and the neighborhood's reputation for peace and quiet. They never stayed long once the cycle began again. Lisa paused in front of the house, studying its Victorian architecture and wraparound porch. Something about the building felt wrong, as if it existed slightly out of phase with the rest of reality. The shadows it cast were too sharp, too dark, and they seemed to move independently of the sun's position in the sky. A child's laughter drifted from somewhere inside the empty house. Lisa's blood went cold. She'd been hearing that sound more frequently over the past few weeks, the distant giggles of children who shouldn't exist, playing games in places that should have been empty. Sometimes the laughter came from abandoned playgrounds, sometimes from shuttered schools, sometimes from her own house late at night when she was the only one home. The sound was always the same, innocent, joyful, and absolutely terrifying in its wrongness. "Hello, Lisa." The voice came from directly behind her, spoken in a tone of friendly greeting that made her skin crawl. She spun around to find a tall, thin man standing on the sidewalk, his face a ruin of burned flesh and exposed bone. He wore the tattered remains of a red and green striped sweater, and his right hand was encased in a leather glove fitted with razor blades that gleamed in the morning sun. It was impossible. She was awake, standing on a public street in broad daylight. The creature that had tormented her dreams couldn't exist in the waking world, couldn't manifest in reality like some twisted genie emerging from a lamp. Could it? "You look surprised to see me," the thing said with amusement, flexing its middle fingers in a gesture that produced a sound like scissors. "Did you really think it was that easy? Did you honestly believe you'd won our little game?" Lisa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't respond to her commands. She was frozen in place, trapped by the creature's presence like a small animal paralyzed by a predator's gaze. The world around them began to shift and blur, the abandoned houses wavering like mirages in desert heat. The morning sun flickered and dimmed, replaced by the artificial glow of stage lights that cast everything in harsh, theatrical shadows. "This whole town, this whole reality, it's all been a performance for my benefit," the creature explained with the patience of a teacher addressing a slow student. Lisa could hear music beginning to play, the familiar mechanical melody of a music box, but distorted now, played at half speed with notes that hung in the air like drops of poison honey. The street beneath Lisa's feet began to feel soft and yielding. When she looked down, she could see that her feet were no longer touching solid ground but rather a circular platform that had begun to rotate slowly, carrying her in an endless waltz. "But here's the beautiful part," the creature said, its grin widening to impossible proportions. "I'm not done with you yet. See, the others were easy, their fears were simple, their deaths quick and clean. But you're special. Your guilt runs so deep, your self-hatred so complete, that I can feed on you for years without running out of material." Lisa tried to scream, but no sound emerged from her throat. She was dancing now, her body moving in the mechanical, jerky motions of a music box ballerina while the creature watched with satisfaction. The music grew louder, more discordant, and Lisa could see other figures joining her on the stage. David was there, spinning in his own mechanical dance, his dead eyes reflecting the stage lights like mirrors. Tommy, Sarah, Billy, Jenny, Mark, all of them moving in perfect synchronization, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal torment. "Welcome to the show that never ends," the creature announced with theatrical flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I give you Lisa Campbell, the final girl who never actually survived." The laughter that followed was not just the creature's but that of an entire audience, hundreds of children who'd died over the decades, all of them trapped in this nightmarish theater, all of them forced to watch as new victims joined their eternal performance. Lisa danced faster now, her movements becoming more frantic as the music box mechanism wound tighter and tighter. She could feel her sanity beginning to snap under the pressure, her sense of reality crumbling like old paper in a fire. But even as madness claimed her, a small part of her mind whispered a terrible question. When had she started dancing? When had the street become a stage? Had she ever really been standing on Main Street at all? Lisa Campbell opened her eyes to find herself lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by white walls and the steady beat of monitoring equipment. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, and she could hear the distant sounds of traffic and normal life continuing beyond the glass. A nurse looked up from her chart with a smile of genuine relief. "Oh good, you're awake. You've been unconscious for 3 days. We were starting to worry." "Where?" Lisa's voice came out as a croak. "Where am I?" "Sacred Heart Hospital, about 50 miles outside Springwood," the nurse explained. "Your parents brought you here after they found you collapsed in your bedroom. Exhaustion and dehydration, the doctors said. You've been through quite an ordeal." Lisa tried to sit up, but her body felt weak and disconnected, as if she'd been bedridden for weeks rather than days. "My friends. Tommy and Sarah and the others." The nurse's expression grew concerned. "Honey, there's no easy way to say this. There was a terrible tragedy in Springwood while you were unconscious. Several of your classmates died in their sleep, some kind of cardiac episodes, the authorities think. I'm so sorry." The news made Lisa nauseous and dizzy, but underneath the grief was something else, confusion. She had vague memories of those deaths, of being present for them somehow, but the details were fuzzy and contradictory. Had she witnessed Tommy's final nightmare, or had she only dreamed about it? Had she really seen Sarah's mind being dissected, or was that just her traumatized psyche trying to process the loss of her friend? "The good news," the nurse continued, "is that your parents have decided to move the family away from Springwood. Your father got a job offer in Portland, and they think a fresh start would be good for everyone." Lisa nodded weakly, but even as relief flooded through her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this scenario. The hospital room felt slightly unreal, the nurse's smile too bright, the sunlight through the windows too perfect. And underneath it all, so faint she might have been imagining it, she could swear she heard the distant sound of a music box playing somewhere in the hospital's depths. The moving truck pulled away from the Campbell house on a crisp October morning, leaving behind tire tracks in the frost-covered driveway and nothing else to mark their passing. Lisa sat in the back seat of her parents' car, watching Springwood recede in the distance as they drove toward their new life in Portland. The town looked normal from this perspective, peaceful, even quaint, with its Victorian houses and tree-lined streets showing the first hints of autumn color. It was hard to believe that such a picturesque place could harbor the kind of evil that had claimed her friends. "I think this move will be good for us," her mother said from the front seat, reaching back to squeeze Lisa's hand. "A chance to start over, to heal from everything that's happened." "Absolutely," her father agreed, his eyes meeting Lisa's in the rearview mirror. "New town, new school, new opportunities. We'll put all this behind us." Lisa nodded and smiled, playing the part of the grateful daughter who was ready to move on with her life. But inside, she was counting the details that didn't quite add up. Her parents' behavior seemed slightly off, their dialogue too scripted, their concern too perfectly timed. And then there was the music box. She'd found it packed carefully in her belongings when they'd loaded the truck, wrapped in tissue paper and nestled between her books like a treasured keepsake. But Lisa had no memory of packing it, no recollection of deciding to bring it with her to their new home. When she'd asked her mother about it, the woman had given her a blank look and claimed no knowledge of how it had gotten into Lisa's things. Maybe it was your brother's, she'd suggested. You know how attached you were to his toys after the accident. But David had never owned a music box, and Lisa knew with absolute certainty that the ornate, mechanical thing was connected to her nightmares in ways she didn't fully understand. Now it sat beside her on the car seat, its painted surface reflecting the passing landscape like a small, distorted mirror. Sometimes, when the car hit a bump or took a sharp turn, she could swear she heard the faint tinkling of its melody, even though the lid remained tightly closed. As they crested a hill and Springwood disappeared completely behind them, Lisa felt a moment of genuine hope. Maybe her parents were right. Maybe this move would give them all a chance to heal, to build new lives free from the shadows of the past. But as the miles rolled by and the music box continued its silent presence beside her, she couldn't escape the growing certainty that some things followed you no matter how far you ran. Some nightmares weren't bound by geography or time or the simple human desire to start over. The music box sat quietly beside her, waiting with infinite patience for the right moment to begin playing again. Inside its mechanism, tiny figures danced, spinning in circles that had no beginning and no end, performing for an audience that would never stop watching, never stop laughing, never stop demanding encore after encore. The show, after all, must go on. But as they drove toward Portland and their new life, she couldn't help but notice that her reflection in the car window looked an awful lot like a ballerina, frozen mid-spin in a music box that never stopped playing its haunting, mechanical song. Some dreams, it seemed, were too perfect to be real. And some realities were too nightmarish to be anything but dreams.